This is Rick from In Front of IT. Welcome back. In this video, I'm going to go over a quick install of Docker Compose on Ubuntu. By the end of this video, you'll be able to install Docker Compose. You'll also be able to bring up an Apache application stack, which I'm using as an example. And I'll go over the Docker Compose configuration file for you. And you'll also have a better understanding of how Docker Compose works and how to use it to manage and access multiple files and stacks. What is Docker Compose? It's a powerful tool that allows you to manage multiple Docker containers as a single application stack. It provides a simple, easy to read way to define and run complex multi-container Docker applications, making it easy to manage and scale your applications. For example, a common Docker Compose file that you'll see is a WordPress application stack with a web front end and a database backend. But at its core, Docker Compose is a tool for defining and running multi-container Docker applications. It allows you to define the application services, networks, and volumes in a single YAML file, and makes it real easy to spin up and tear down your entire application stack with just a couple of commands. With Docker Compose, you can easily orchestrate complex multi-container applications, and that makes it an essential tool for both developers and system administrators or engineers. Whether you're building a microservices architecture or managing a web application that's complex or simple, Docker Compose is an invaluable tool for managing your Docker containers. And without any further delay, let's get in front of it. So if you've been watching my videos for a while, you should be used to this step by now. As always, the first thing we're going to do is a sudo apt update and sudo apt upgrade, just to be on the safe side. Always update your packages before you make any major changes or install new packages or anything of that nature. And if you're running in a virtual machine, it's always wise to take a snapshot before you start your updates. After the update is completed, we're going to reboot this VM since there was an upgrade of Docker, as you can see in the highlighted line there. So just to play it on the safe side, technically you shouldn't have to do a reboot. You could just stop and restart Docker. For example, if this was a production environment and you couldn't reboot the system. But in this case, since it's a test virtual machine, we're going to go ahead and reboot it here, just to make sure that all the dependencies are restarted correctly without having to do it individually. Next up, I'm going to try something a little different here. Start up a text editor and type the commands in there so we can follow along easily with each step, and you can see the commands that I'm typing in as I'm doing them and the history. The first command we're going to type in is sudo apt install docker-compose-plugin, and that will pretty much install the entire Docker Compose suite and all the necessary dependencies. Typing in the command in the terminal, it will install the packages that are needed, which is just Docker Compose plugin in this case. Now, if you don't have Docker installed, it should install Docker as well, since that's a needed dependency. But a better move is to watch the video that I have about installing Docker in Ubuntu. That'll go through the whole process of installing Docker, setting it up and testing it and verifying it works as needed. And it's a quick video. Now I'm going to run the command docker compose version. And that's going to verify two things. One, that it's actually installed, and two, just let you know what version's installed if you ever need to know that. I'm also running Docker info just to make sure that Docker is installed. I know it is, but it's a good habit to verify that it's installed, and a test to verify that Docker is running. A quick test is to run docker run hello world, which will pull down a container, the hello world container. If you don't have it, if you do have it, it'll just run it. But either way, that verifies that Docker is installed and running correctly. Next up, we're going to work on the actual Docker compose file. And the first step is to have somewhere to work on it. Now with Docker Compose, everything is done typically in the context of the directory that the Docker Compose file is in. And technically you can put it anywhere you want and manage it from there. So in this case, we're going to go into the documents directory. And then from there, we're going to make a directory to work on the actual Docker Compose file. In this case, I'm creating a directory called test-website. And obviously you can call this directory whatever you want. Before we go any further though, I'm going to go over each line in this Docker Compose file, just to give you an idea and an explanation of what it does, so you can understand what's going on here. So basically this Docker Compose file is written in a language called YAML, which is used in various places, programs like Ansible. Kubernetes uses it as well. So it's a pretty standard and well-used format, similar to JSON in terms of what it's used for, but different. So the first line in this Docker Compose file is called version 3.9. And that specifies the version of the Docker Compose syntax that's being used. Now, typically you always want to use the latest version. The only time you don't is when you're working with others that might be using an older version, be it other systems, other programmers or developers. They might be using an older version like 3 or 2. So in that case, you would have to use that version as well, just for compatibility purposes. The next line is called services. And what this does is everything under that, which is indented, are the services that will be run by this Docker Compose file. The next line we got is called Apache. Now in this case, Apache is simply the name of the service. And technically you can call the service whatever you want, but you want to give it a name that kind of matches what the application is that's running in the container under that service, so that when you're doing management of it, troubleshooting, looking at logs, looking at the status, what have you, you'll know what component in that Docker Compose is what. So in this case, since we're going to be running an Apache container in this service, we're using the name Apache. The next line is pretty important. That is the name of the image. And what that is the name of the container that's going to be pulled down from your Docker repository, which in this case is Docker Hub, because the Docker repo is not defined. There are examples out there on the internet. I'm not going to go into it in this video, that will show how you can pull it from a custom repository. HTTPD is the name of the container in Docker Hub. And we're using latest in this version. If you look at my other Docker video, you'll see where I discuss what that means. Latest, pretty self-explanatory. That's the latest version of the container. In a production environment, you would want to define or limit that to a specific version, so that if you're doing updates, restarts, anything like that, you don't inadvertently pull down a later version of an image, which might break your application in a production environment. Container name is just the descriptive name of the container under this service. We're calling it here My Apache App. And as you can see, obviously you can use whatever name you want. I believe if you don't give it a name, it would use one of those Docker default names. But I'd recommend when you're doing Docker Compose files, you give the container a name so that that standard is matched and carried out throughout the deployment of this Compose file. The next line, ports, is the TCP ports that are mapped for the container. Now since this is a web container, by default it listens on port 80. So that's the right side of the colon. On the left side is what that port is going to be mapped to on the system that it's running on. So in this case, it will be the VM itself. So you will be able to access the container over port 8080, and it will map that to port 80 on the container. And the reason we are using 8080 here is because ports lower than 1024 in Linux are restricted only to processes that run as root. And you don't want a container running privileged as root under most circumstances anyway, for security reasons. Final line is volumes, and that specifies a volume, or in this case, a directory to be mounted in the container. So specifically in this case, it's mapping the local directory test website, which is the directory we created, to the container's user local Apache htdocs directory. Now, if you're not familiar with Apache, by default, that is the directory where you would have your web page files that are served on the website. So if you're following here, basically you can create your web files, your web pages, your HTML files, CSS files, what have you, in that test website directory, and they will be mapped to that htdocs directory in the container and served up on the website. And we'll go through that here so you can see how that works. So continuing on, what I'm doing now is creating a actual web page that we can use with the Apache container for demonstration purposes. By default, the Apache container looks for a file called index.html. So that's the file I'm going to be creating here. And here I have the content that I'm going to put into the HTML file. Nothing serious or complicated, just a hello world sentence. You know, doing anything more than that is beyond the scope of this, since we're just testing out the actual container and verifying that it works. This should be enough. So we're going to go ahead and paste it into the HTML file and save it, and just type cat index.html just to verify that the text is there. Next, we're going to go up one directory back into the documents folder. And in here, we're going to create the actual Docker Compose file. And in here, we're going to copy and paste the actual Docker Compose YAML data from the text editor that we went over earlier in the video. Like with the web page file, we're going to go ahead and save it and then do a cat docker-compose.yaml just to verify that the file looks good. Next up, we're actually going to run the container. And we do that by running this command, docker compose up. And think of it this way. We use the docker compose command. We add the word up, as in bringing up the container and starting it. And as we'll show later, the opposite, to stop the container, will be docker compose down. And once you hit enter, you'll see that it actually, similar to the docker run command, it pulls down the container if this is your first time running this docker compose file. What you'll see here also is that it'll create a network and name the container, all of that which is specified. And what you're seeing is the actual logs for the Apache container. When you run Docker Compose this way, it's running interactively. So you don't go back to a command prompt, you'll just see the log output on your console screen as the container runs, and in this case for Apache, as the Apache container takes web traffic. Now there is a way to run the Docker Compose container in the background. So you'll come right back to a command prompt in your console and you can continue doing work. And we'll show that later on in this video. So now we're going to fire up our Firefox browser and we're going to connect to the container so we could see the actual web page that we created. And we hit the container by typing in HTTP, localhost, and port 8080. And we're using 8080 because if you recall from the Docker Compose file, in the port section, we have 8080 mapping to 80 on the container. 80 is the standard HTTP port for the web, and in this case for the Apache container. But we can't use 80 locally because we're not running the container as root, as I mentioned before. So we're using 8080. And once we hit enter, there's our web page. Now we're going to bring down the container so we can go to the next step. And since we ran the container interactively, you don't really have your command prompt where you could run any type of commands. So you just press Control C or Control break, and that will bring down the container. And just to do a sanity check and verify that the container is not running, I'm running a docker ps-a. And if you recall from the other video, docker ps will show you containers that are active. And when you add a -a, it'll show you containers that are active as well as stopped, showing you all containers. And as we can see here, we have that container, my Apache app, from the Docker Compose, and it exited 6 seconds ago, which is when we hit the control break. Now we're going to run the command again, but this time we're going to add a -d. And -d stands for daemon mode or run in the background, which is exactly as it says. Start up the container and return you back to a command prompt with the container running in the background. When I run Docker Compose, this is usually the way I run it. And now running another command that Docker Compose has, docker compose ps. Similar to docker ps, this one will show the state of a Docker Compose setup that you have. And in this case, it's showing us that my Apache app Docker Compose application stack is running for 6 seconds. And as you can see, we have the name of the application stack, which is my Apache app, the image that it's running, the command that's running in the image, and the service name. All of this is what's in the Docker Compose file. And then you can see when it was created, how long it's been running, or what the status is. In this case, it's up for 6 seconds. And even the ports that it's listening on, which in this case is listening on 8080 on the local IP address. And doing a quick refresh of the browser, we see that the page comes up again. With the container running in the background though, how do we stop it? We can't do a Control C this time like we can when we were running it interactively. So in this case, you run the command docker compose down. And as I mentioned before, like the opposite of the up command, docker compose down will bring down the Docker Compose application stack. And once you hit enter, you'll see that it stops and removes the container and then removes the networking information that it added for the Docker Compose stack as well. So using Docker Compose down makes Docker Compose clean up after itself. And going back to the browser and clicking refresh, we can see that the page no longer exists since the container is down. And suppose we want to change up the web page or the content and test it again. So there's a couple of ways to do this. One way is to bring down the application stack with your Docker Compose down command and edit the files as you need. And we're going to show that here. So we already brought down the container. We're going to go into the test website directory where that HTML file lives, and we're going to edit it. We go ahead and save the file and run docker compose up -d again to bring up the container. Going back to the browser, we can see that the file has been updated in the browser and in the container. but there's no need to go through all that. You can edit the HTML file while the container is running, and the Apache container will just pick it up. We'll go into the file, we'll change some words, and we'll save it. And then we'll go to the browser and we'll do a refresh. And as you can see, the new HTML file was picked up by the container. So what if we're running it in the background, but we want to see the logs? That's pretty easy with Docker Compose. At your command line, in that directory where your Docker Compose file is, you run the command docker compose logs. And that will bring up the logs, and this is great for troubleshooting your Docker Compose stack. And there you have it, how to use Docker Compose. Docker Compose can be very useful in initial development, creating application stacks, multiple versions of applications, and is one of the best ways to quickly share an application setup that you might have with a friend who's a developer or an associate who's a developer. I would highly recommend getting Docker Compose installed and messing around with it, getting familiar and comfortable with it, because it's one of the best ways to do development in Docker. If you found this video helpful, please like and subscribe. And let me know in the comments if there's any application stack you would like to see a Docker Compose walkthrough for. This is Rick from In Front of IT, signing out.